So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write the columns.php file that I showed earlier, or rather I described earlier. The purpose of this file will be to log on to the database server and implement the uploads, essentially. So it will implement the post method referenced in the web page, and will also, thanks to Ajax, report back whether the submission was successful. Because if you looked at the code from the original project, we'll open the folder here. Look at the index page here. The index page only has references to the post method here, columns.php, which we're about to write, and the columns in the database. I would argue that in a perfect world, HTML should be able to do this, because it has the information it needs other than the login information, and of course you could add the login information. But PHP is typically what you would use, and as I've said before, you could also put this PHP inside of this HTML file. But I was originally composing this as a Cordova application, which means that the application would have to reside on a mobile phone instead of on a web server, which means the PHP would have to be run remotely from a web server or potentially the database server that would be receiving the data. But here I'm going to build this as a pure web application that happens to use a page wrapper, referencing a PHP file. So now we'll write that PHP file. And as I said before, this will be called columns. This follows fairly common practice in PHP development. You don't have to call it columns, just as long as your reference here there we go. As long as you put in the correct file name there, you can use any file name you like for this. But I'm just following convention. The first step is I have to connect to the database. This is one of the most cantankerous bits of code in PHP in my experience, because sometimes there are errors in connecting to the local host, which is your own machine. In my case, I suspected I might have a problem with this when I was developing this software, but it turned out it was just minor typos. So it took a while to figure it out, because all your coding generally has to be ideal. So in any case, your first line of code is you have to assign MSQLi connect, or whichever function in PHP that you're using to connect, because there are several, you have to assign it to a variable. So that will be connect in this case. Sometimes people shorten this to con. I just think this is easier. MSQLi connect. This is one of the more buggy ways to do this in modern versions of PHP, but I managed to get it to work. This is the procedural way, because if you were going to do this in object-oriented programming, you would go new MSQLi, strangely with a space. I don't know why that is. But we're going to do it procedurally. And the next thing is your username for the database itself, not your web page. And you would never want a username that says root, because it's too easy for hackers to figure out. And even more so, you would never want a password that says root. But this is on the local machine. And This is just for testing. But in any case, we have here the database server. Normally this would be a URL on the internet, but not here. We have a username, which would normally be a real username, and we have root, which would normally be a rather difficult to remember password, which would then be hashed on the database server to make it even harder to figure out. Next thing you need is the database name. This is not the table name, but the database name. And notice all of these are in single quotes. I think some people use double quotes for these, but I've been taught to use single quotes. I think that either will work. So then we put in a semicolon. Another thing you want to do is you want to enable error messages in PHP. So how you do that will depend on your computer. I would say look that up, because if you run into bugs with this command in particular, you're going to want to know where the bug is in your code so that you can make sure it's not you, because that will save you a lot of work. But how to do that will depend on your computer. I'm running Windows 10, but this, as I said before, will run as far back as Windows 7, and MAMP was originally developed for Mac OS. There is also a distinction between MAMP and a real database server. Strangely enough, a real, or maybe not so strangely, a real database server will run a lot better with fewer bugs, because that's what they would use in the real world, and so most database servers are more robust than MAMP. So the next line of code, speaking of that, is we're going to set up our own error messages for this. I found in testing that this doesn't always work, and this is why you want to have PHP errors enabled in PHP itself. So if there is a MySQL connect error in MSQLi connect, my connect variable is standing in for it here, open curly brackets, you want to get an error message, so we will write one right here, echo, failed to connect to the database. And as I said, this will only work if this code is working. So again, you want to have your PHP errors enabled in case this doesn't work. Okay, so semicolon, don't forget your semicolons. Echo MySQLi error. Again, in relation to connect. And what this will do is that if it's working correctly, it will give you the specific error that will make it easier to debug. I will reiterate that you're in better shape if you enable PHP errors on your computer. And I may do a video specifically on that in this series, but right now we're just talking about, in the perfect world, how you would code your columns file.